that creates future park superintendents, probably.
Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where you are invited into the hearts and stories of those who have committed their careers to the protection and preservation of our great national parks. Who Runs This Park aims to be a catalyst for inspiration, highlighting all that goes into managing our national parks and building a sense of appreciation for the invaluable beauty, diversity, and history of our protected lands. Today we have Dave Roemer with us, Glacier National Park Superintendent. Glacier National Park, located in northern Montana, is a showcase of melting glaciers, alpine meadows with delicious mountain berries, might I add, and awe-inspiring lakes. With the famous Going to the Sun Road and historic chalets and lodges, it's not a park to miss. Dave himself has been Glacier Superintendent since 2020 and has made his mark across the National Park Service, caring deeply about partnerships with local and tribal communities and about ensuring his decisions are what is best for the future generations in the park. Dave's love for our parks is evident, and his hopes for Glacier are inspiring, aiming for Glacier to be a leader in sustainability, a driver of change for addressing the climate crisis, and a model for working with tribes and partners. Let's jump in. Dave, it's such an honor to have you today. Welcome to Who Runs This Park.
Thanks, Betty. Yeah, it's great to be here.
I have to start with a silly question, but when I was in Glacier last summer, I ate huckleberries at every chance I could. So I have to ask what your favorite way to eat huckleberries is since you've been up in Glacier.
Just right along the trail. So I never buy them out in the market. You see huckleberry everything. I just eat them and snack while I hike.
Yeah, that's probably the best answer. I was a fan of the huckleberry ice cream pretty much everywhere it was offered, but on the trail, definitely can't be beat.
If you can find them growing next to the thimbleberries, then you can put them both together and have a little berry sandwich. That's my favorite way.
Ooh, I don't think I had any of the thimbleberries, so I'll look out for that next time. What is one of the more unique situations you've had thus far as Glacier Superintendent?
It's not so much as a superintendent, but hiking in the park. My colleagues, other superintendents, when I get together with them and we have little icebreakers and talk about most memorable things that happen in parks, I'm really fortunate. A lot of them have stories in Glacier. A lot of them are in Glacier with bears, actually. But I had an encounter with a mule deer last summer. We were both occupying about, 2 feet of trail between a cliff and a wall.
Oh, wow.
And as it squeezed by me, I just held my camera out and took a quick picture. And in the picture, as I showed people, it looks like the mule deer is teleporting. The camera glitched or something. And so I showed it to a lot of my friends. They were really impressed with our teleporting mule deer. And as far as I know, the other wildlife haven't figured out how to do that yet. But yeah, we were that close on the trail with my back flattened against the wall, and the mule deer kind of scooted past me.
Yeah, that's making me think of, I had a similar experience with a bighorn sheep in Glacier last summer where we were hiking and it was pretty steep and the bighorn sheep was in the middle of the trail. And so we were the first people to get there and we kind of just waited, hoping it would go the other way or hike up into the brush or something. And a bunch of other people came up behind us. And then we ended up getting cornered by 2 on each side of our groups. And so we had to get similarly, like against the rock wall. And I had my hiking poles out in front of me being like, hopefully it doesn't ram its horns, but it miraculously scurrying up a rock face that you wouldn't even have thought it could go up. But it was it was pretty intense. We were all trying to not disturb it and let it just carry on. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot of wildlife throughout Glacier.
It's a wildlife park. I think impossible to come here without having some kind of wildlife encounter. I like my bears to be like little specks in the distance when I take their picture, but sometimes they get closer too. So it's a big part of what we do here.
Yeah. That's definitely out of the parks I've been to. One where you're pretty religious about having bear spray, again, hoping you don't need to use it. But that's actually something I was curious about it does seem like Glacier kind of bears per capita. There's a ton versus Banff National Park in Canada. Is that something you have analyzed yet in regards to just the number of bears per capita or per square mile and why it's necessarily so concentrated?
Yeah, well, actually, I think part of the answer is kind of what you alluded to, is that the bear populations in Canada have a lot of space and are doing pretty healthy. And Glacier is right on the doorstep of Canada. For grizzly bears, we have probably among the highest density in the United States for grizzly bears outside of Alaska.
Wow.
So it's a great way to see them, right? And we're very fortunate that we have largely intact wildlife assemblages, not just grizzly bears, but wolves, wolverines, mountain lions, black bears, someday soon, bison. There's a lot of interesting things happening here, and it's great you can see it all.
That's actually a great segue. And I do kind of, throughout this interview, we'll go back in history and time a little bit to some of your previous experiences. But I'd love to hear, I know the bison reintegration into Glacier National Park in partnership with the Blackfeet Nation.
Yeah, and they are really the authors writ large of the Iini initiative to bring bison. Iiniwa is the Blackfeet name for bison back to their homelands. We're working most directly with the Blackfeet Nation in Browning, Montana, is kind of where they're headquartered. The reservation for the Blackfeet borders Glacier National Park along all of the east side. And so we work very closely together. And for the park's part, it's important to honor our trust responsibility and our treaty responsibilities to the Blackfeet and to support them in their sovereign actions to bring Inuit back to their homelands. And it's fascinating work. So I feel so fortunate to be invited to be a part of it, that we can show our support. It's impossible to overstate how important this is for the Blackfeet, an animal that they're so closely identified with culturally, historically, using it for food, using it for everything. A lot of their identity and culture is tightly bound to the health of bison.
And how were, I guess, two questions with that come to mind. First off, how were the bison originally eradicated from the area? Was it from or through hunting?
Yeah, hunting, slaughter might be the fairer term for it.
Yeah.
And really just a couple of generations is all it took to functionally eliminate bison from the landscape across large swaths of America.
Wow.
And the plains. And that was a devastating impact to tribes that derived their livelihood and their resources, their food, their shelter, their everything from bison. So being able to work with the Blackfeet again to bring bison back is a small token towards reconciliation and understanding the grievous wrongs that were committed.
Yeah.
You know, putting the tribes into starvation situations where they were forced to give up even more rights. The whole half of Glacier National Park on the east side was originally within the Blackfeet Reservation, and under considerable duress during a starvation winter, the Blackfeet signed a contract to no longer have that in their reservation. So these are really, really hard memories. And I think also from a tribal perspective, not so long ago at all. And so they're still, I think, felt in a contemporary way in Blackfeet territory.
Yeah, and I appreciate you kind of sharing some of that context. And what comes to mind, first off, out of curiosity with the bison, when I think of Glacier, the parts of the park that I saw, it was super mountainous. So kind of where are you expecting the bison to naturally be within the park? Is it more in the valleys, or do you envision them traveling up into some of the more mountainous regions?
Yeah, you know, we all have this image, right, of bison being a plains animal. And we have images of grizzly bears being mountain animals, and grizzly bears are expanding into the plains. And bison will certainly go into the mountains in both Waterton Lakes National Park, our international peace park partner to the north, and in Glacier. We found remains of bison up above 7,000 feet, I think even higher. And just in modern times with bison that are roaming free in Banff, they're going up and using those mountain habitats. So I think we'll learn a lot from bison, having them back on the landscape.
Yeah, that'll be awesome. And how does that process of into the environment work? And at what point in the process are both like Glacier National Park and Blackfeet Nation?
Last June was the first release of wild bison. They were transboundary bison. Some of them did cross into Alberta. and caused a little bit of a stir. And it was decided that we wanted them back on the Montana side for various reasons. But so far, everywhere that the bison have gone, there have been friendships and better communication in their wake. So that's very hopeful.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
can't
an
really
international
control where they
boundary
go.
definitely makes things even more complicated having that international boundary there. But the release site was outside of Glacier on the
Okay.
reservation, and we believe that there will be further reintroductions of bison, probably to that same location. And
Okay.
they wear, not all of them, but they wear GPS collars so that they could be remotely tracked by the Blackfeet. And whether or not any of them have gone into Glacier yet, I actually couldn't tell you. I don't believe they have.
Okay.
And, as much as I'd like to know for certain that a bison is crossed back in, that's not really the metric here. That's not the
Right.
important thing. The important thing is that they're back, that they're wild. They come from genetic relatives of the actual bison that were last taken
Oh,
from Blackfeet
cool.
country in the 1800s. So their story coming back is really neat.
And where, location wise, were these bisons previously?
Yeah, so you got to go way back to when the herd was captured, but those bison wound up for most of the generations up in Canada at Elk
Okay.
Island National Park. And so that's where they were wild and not being interbred with cattle. And that's where I think in 2016, a large number of bison were brought back to the Blackfeet and kept in pens and managed as a herd there to increase the herd to be ready for the day that happened last June.
Cool. And is the idea evaluating how they're integrating into the land and seeing if you in the future or reintegrate more or release more bison to the environment?
Yeah, I'm so fortunate to be able to work in this area where bringing bison back is ecological restoration, cultural restoration, and justice. It's the intersection of all of those.
Yeah,
It's
that's
a really
cool.
rich space to be working in. And I can tell you there's a lot of monitoring around the ecological parameters of bison coming back. So we're
Right.
doing a lot of baseline surveys before there's hooves on the ground to measure the quality of the vegetation, the songbird diversity, insects, you name it. And within the first minutes of bison being back into the area they were released to, we were watching some of the bison just hammering this young aspen tree. And that's what they do. They convert those aspen woodlands back to prairie grasslands. And so
Oh, whoa.
watching them do that right away was textbook. They're transformers of their environment. They will leave behind a richer environment, habitat for more species that have also been in decline. So being able to monitor and inventory that along the way is going to be a very fascinating story.
Yeah. And like you said, I'm thinking back to what we were saying earlier of how much we'll learn from the bison, of being able to understand where they go within both the Blackfeet Nation and Glacier National Park, and how are they acting to our expectations, where are they not, stuff like that. So it'll be exciting to keep tabs on that. If I looked back at some of your previous experience, you actually had experience reintegrating condors in Redwood National Park. Can you share a little bit about that and how these two situations are both similar and unique?
Yeah, the similarities are, I think, pretty apparent. They're indigenous-led endeavors that the Park Service has helped support. And the Park Service is doing this because it aligns with our mission, both for ecosystem restoration and for having native species back where they once were. When I was at Redwood National and State Parks, California State Parks, and the National Park Service were working with the Yurok to bring condors back. This bird with a 9 to 10-foot wingspan that, again, many people didn't think of the redwoods as condor habitat. They always think of desert environments, but they were along the coast all the way up to British Columbia. Lewis and Clark, in their journals at the mouth of the Columbia, drew pictures of California condors there. So in the case of the redwoods, condors had been absent for about a century, and some of the ceremonies that are most important to the Yurok had also been not held for about a century. Some of those ceremonies actually involve condor feathers in the regalia that are danced at those ceremonies. And so it really couldn't be more apparent that being involved in bringing condors back was both an important ecological action, vitally important culturally, danced in the highest ceremonies that the Yurok have, and a very strong underlining of tribal sovereignty, of tribes taking those actions to make their world whole. So I just feel really honored to have worked with the people that I worked with in California. And I still follow them on Facebook. There's 11
Oh, cool.
condors flying over Redwood National and State Parks in skies where they hadn't been for more than a century. And the people working on that mean everything to me.
Yeah, the significance of both that and the work with the bison reintroduction it's hard to put into words. And so it's cool to hear you talk about both of them. With the condors specifically, and again, I don't have any experience as a biologist or knowing these sort of things. So at what point would it be determined, okay, we need to stop reintroducing more condors, or this population is sufficient or back to what we think it was 100 years ago?
Yeah, there are a number of condor reintroduction sites now, and they all kind of fit into a plan for condors that calls for a certain number. I'm forgetting the details, but generally you have these different metapopulations of condors being able to reproduce in the wild, not experiencing, hopefully in the future, the rates of mortality that they do due to lead poisoning. So once those parameters are being met, then it would be amazing. I mean, that is what the ultimate goal is to not have to provide so much help for condors and for other species that are endangered, but for them to have self-sustaining populations. So there's a lot of things about their environment and their population structure that need to be true before we'll know that we're there.
Yeah. And did you say that it was for them specifically, it was lead poisoning?
Yeah, for condors and for other species too. Golden eagles are susceptible to ingesting lead, and the toxic effects of that upon them are just very, very devastating.
Was that from mining in the area or just like human products?
A lot of it is lead in the environment from gut piles from hunting. And condors are very social birds, and so they'll all go to the same food source. And if that food source is contaminated with lead ammunition, then you can get into a very complex problem with a lot of animals all at once. So there's a lot of hunter education and a lot of other actions that take place so that condors and people can be in the same space safely.
Yeah, and if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was a quote you had in an interview, but kind of how you're saying there's a lot of hunter education. It's also saying, as more people are visiting parks for the first time, there's a lot of leave no trace education. You can't really assume that people know what that means and kind of have that internalized. And so I am continuously reminded of the importance of these different aspects. And it's interesting to hear, even from the hunter perspective, these different ways of educating. And typically when people are educated about the long-term effects of something, or kind of are more aware of how actions affect certain things, the hope is that they'll change their actions. So it's cool to hear you talk about
whether it's hunters or hikers. Both groups are ardent conservationists at heart, and so there are many hunters that are helping to spread that word and try to increase the adoption of non-lead ammunition and other practices that can prevent the poisoning of condors and other animals.
Yeah, that's interesting. Jumping back quickly before we jump back forward to Glacier National Park, what got you into the environmental communications, environmental studies world in the first place?
Yeah, it wasn't something that as a young kid that I just jumped on right away. I can think back to some early experiences and kind of say, all right, well, that makes sense. I know I liked that trip with my family going camping and things like that. When I was at Antioch College in Ohio, I wanted to start off straight as a filmmaker.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I thought it was neat. And, but what do you want to make films of? And I thought, wow, I really want to be like the National Geographic filmmaker. That's what I want to do. And film was too expensive for me. So I shifted my plan a little bit with some help from the science department and transitioned over into environmental issues and the outdoors, and wound up crafting a self-designed major in environmental communications. And I went straight to the University of Montana next. Going to Montana now was definitely doubling down on the outdoors part of it. In fact, I was going to go to Montana or Alaska. They were the last two schools that were in the running for me. And I meet many people in Montana that will say the same thing. It's either here or Alaska. Interesting. We're all kind of being pushed towards the place where we want to be, or being pulled towards it. And, Montana's kind of the last best place. I loved grad school here. I loved Montana. Moving west, being in the mountains, it was all new to me. And by that time, I had started working as a volunteer for the Park Service and done a couple seasons.
Okay.
So I knew that my interests and maybe my career were sort of moving in a line towards each other just slightly.
Yeah, I think it's sweet. And I saw this across a lot of different interviews and articles of just the fact that you got to come back to Montana and, coming as superintendent of Glaciers really, yeah, I don't know what the right word is for that. It's cool, sweet, and exciting.
It's nice to be able to close a circle in your life.
Yeah,
And,
it doesn't always happen.
yeah, so coming back around to it, and I remember being a quote unquote starving grad student, wondering if I'd ever could get employment in this state. And I feel like I've done all right. I certainly
Yeah.
I certainly feel like I've got one of the best jobs I could ever imagine. I feel so fortunate to be at Glacier. So that's been thank you for saying that. It's been a fun part of my journey, being able to connect back to my grad school years here.
Yeah, that's cool. Perfect segue into Glacier. You had mentioned some experiences you've had, like hiking with the mule deer. But as you've become superintendent, what are some ways that you have explored the park? What are new areas you discovered that you were surprised by?
Well, I've barely scratched the surface of this park.
It's a huge park. I feel like,
yeah,
we spent a couple days there and really all I know is the going to the sun road. And I'm like, man, I want to go back and just backpack for a week or two and I'll barely scratch anything.
Exactly. It's an enormous park. And, that's what makes it special, is that it is a large landscape, an intact landscape. There are, I believe it's written, 700 miles of trails to be on. So I've seen some of the park now by raft, a lot of it
cool.
by foot, driving to the major areas, getting there by boat. Like Goat Haunt last year, which you can cross. Goat Haunt. Isn't that a great name?
Is that
Goat
the
Haunt,
lake?
It's on the south end of Waterton Lake. And so
okay.
you can drive around Canada and from Waterton Lakes National Park, get on a boat to Goat Haunt and get your passport stamped in the U.S.
Oh, cool.
Or you could hike to Goat Haunt, but it's a couple days from either side. So yeah, it's really out there. It's a beautiful place. And I've seen it by helicopter too. In my first year, we had a very well-behaved fire. I'm happy to say it just
nice.
skunked around and did everything the way a superintendent of Glacier during their first summer would want it to. It didn't get too crazy, but
yeah, that's good.
Yeah, it's this park is going to last more than a lifetime of adventure for me. So I like backpacking. I love rafting. So I'm going to continue to do those things. My kids are 14 and 12 right now, so I usually try and take them with me on the backpacking trips. And,
heck yeah. My first backpacking trip was when I was in college. And so anytime I hear of kids getting a taste for it a little bit younger, I'm like, man, I just think it's awesome. I honestly don't know what I would have thought of backpacking as a teenager, but it's really cool that they have that experience.
We discovered that during the pandemic, actually, the first summer when they were unscheduled because all of their summer camps and other activities were canceled. I, thank goodness, thought to fill in the gap there and start scheduling some backpacking trips in Redwoods.
Heck yeah. So, Glacier is not a bad spot to continue that on. One thing while you're talking, and again, I have a ton of different areas we can go into from a Glacier perspective, but one thing I did see and I thought was really admirable was that you actually worked with the employees at the entrances to better understand their experience and help it inform kind of your plans. And for folks who don't know, there's a car reservation system, which is a big initiative I know at Glacier that we can dive into. But first, just wanted to say, I think getting that hands-on experience and understanding, like more so from the ground, what are main issues? How can I bubble certain things up? And then I was curious if you had plans to do similar things in other areas of the park.
Oh yeah, it's too much fun to do that. Actually,
You're like it's impeding me from my other duties.
Yeah, I have to schedule it because there's so many things to do. But it's the most rewarding day in the park for me is to get out into the park. And I was working alongside the employees who are greeting visitors. And in a situation it's a really challenging one. You want to welcome them, but you also have to find out really in a matter of seconds whether or not they have their vehicle reservation and drive straight, or if they don't and make a right-hand turn and get more information. And if those conversations take longer than a few seconds, then the traffic backs up and it actually becomes unsafe to do that. So it's kind of a
Oh,
high pressure
interesting.
environment. And
Yeah.
I was not good at it. So not only getting a chance to work alongside people in the field, but getting to show them that they do it better than me was kind of a
Yeah.
valuable aspect
Yeah, it's
of that
humbling.
day. And it's yeah, obviously it's what I want to do because that's how I will learn what's really happening in
Right.
the park, and because we want our employees and all facets of our organization to know that they matter and
Yeah,
to feel
absolutely.
listened to, so that their innovative ideas and solutions for doing things better don't just die on the vine, but can be passed up through supervisors and every now and then maybe even directly to the superintendent. That's how we become a better park.
Yeah. Is there anything currently on the schedule in that realm of working in the field, or more so needs to be scheduled at some point?
Yeah, our seasonals aren't really on yet. We're doing this interview
True.
in late February, so but I'll be having a lot of meetings with them at their onboarding sessions when they come in,
Oh, cool.
because we hire about 400 or so people for the
When
summer.
does that seasonal season start for Glacier?
For some folks, maybe in late April, but usually by
Okay.
May and early June, that's when we have pretty constant onboarding sessions for new employees
Okay.
and returning seasonal employees. So it's a
Cool.
lot of welcoming and welcoming back. And because I like to drink coffee in the park, I'm undertaking a little mini tour this summer, drink coffee with the superintendent, and I'm planning to
Oh,
schedule a number of venues, especially on the east side of the park and the far corners that I don't always get to, just where I can be there. I'll bring my own coffee and just be available to sit and talk. And I'm looking forward to that.
I love drinking coffee also. So that's just a fun thing to look forward to. Is that more so for employees, or is it for like visitors to also so and so grab a coffee with the superintendent?
Yeah, it's aimed at our staff, at our employees and
Okay.
volunteers. And I'll drink coffee with anybody. So I'll drink coffee with
Yeah.
visitors too.
So that's cool. What, since it is, late February, almost March, what are common ways that folks recreate in Glacier outside of the summer season?
It snowed this morning. We're not having the best winter in terms of snowfall and in terms of storing that moisture for the year ahead. But winter recreation is alive and well and very enjoyable. So people snowshoe in the lower
Cool.
elevations, cross country ski a little bit, check the avalanche forecast before putting on your backcountry skis and doing something a little more high elevation, a little more sloped. But people do that too. I'm not good enough on skis to be a confident backcountry skier. I do hit the downhill areas at the resort. And gosh, there's some people that ice climb in the park. And someone sent me a photograph of one of their favorite things to do early in the season before it snowed a lot, but it had been cold enough to have the lakes freeze. They go up and ice skate on it, and sometimes
Oh, so cool.
even play some hockey on the lake and in what has to be the world's most beautiful outdoor ice arena.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some experience backcountry skiing, but never without, I did that like through Knowles, if you're familiar with
Oh,
Knowles,
yeah.
but never on my own. And so I need a lot more avalanche education before I'm either taking myself and some friends out. But man, it sounds like a dream to ice skate on an alpine lake. That just, I've, as I have these conversations, things just keep getting added. Like, oh yeah, I want to try that. I want to try this. It never ceases to amaze me, the new things that I'm like, okay, that's been added to the bucket list. Got it.
There's magical things to do in the park, all year round, and even in the summer too, when it's crowded. And you can feel in this park in the summer surrounded by people. There's always a way to find some quiet and some solitude,
Yeah.
not too far away from where everyone is. I've had those experiences even on the south rim of the Grand Canyon visiting parks. So it's a little bit a matter of perspective and of
Yeah.
noticing what's in the environment. And it's really not hard to do at Glacier.
One thing, and I said this in the intro, one thing I loved when I was reading different articles and preparing for our conversation was just the way that you talked about Glacier being a leader in both like how to deal with impacts of climate change, sustainability. And I would love to hear a little bit more about some of those hopes and kind of different maybe initiatives or studies that you're doing that align with that.
I'll start off by saying that there's a lot more that we can do and should do. We are a climate friendly park, meaning that we've made a commitment to continual improvement. to looking for
Oh,
ways
cool.
to mitigate our impact on carbon emissions. It's difficult to say because obviously a popular park entails a lot of carbon emissions with our own operations and with visitation. But, other areas of climate change, Glacier has to be a part of the story.
Yeah.
Our name really kind of takes you there. And, the truth of it is that really under pretty much all of the probable scenarios of climate future, that the glaciers that are remaining at Glacier disappear. They're small glaciers.
Yeah.
They're smaller, in fact, than other parks that aren't named Glacier, but that also have glaciers. And so, Glacier still deserves its name. It's a park that's formed through glacial processes, and that won't change. But
Yeah, of course.
in the story of the snowfields and the glaciers themselves, it's going to be a continuing study of loss and of observing the rate of that and trying to mitigate against some of the most negative impacts of that.
Right.
So what I'm really proud of Glacier for, and realize I'm talking about efforts that were started way before I got here, so I'm not taking any credit, but we've been pretty forward thinking in terms of looking at climate change adaptation, how to be resilient, and how to be directive in adapting to climate change. The project that we're engaged in right now on the east side of the divide at Gunsight Lake is one in which we are removing non-native fish, and we'll be planting next year into those high altitude lakes west slope cutthroat trout and bull trout, two species that are either state or federally listed, and they need cold water. So this is a cold water refugia for them.
Cool.
And it's a bold management action. Before this lake had been planted with non-native fish, it had been naturally fishless. There were no fish in there.
Oh, interesting.
You can really nerd out on the philosophy of park management on a topic like this. And you can say, well, is the desired goal then to return it to its normal fishless state? Or is this an opportunity through which we can create a refugia that's going to give us a longer lease on existence for these two cold water adapted rare species? And so actions like that we're taking, I think, are probably needed in more places.
Yeah.
If we want to have these resources, we want to have these fish around. And so in that way, I'm happy that Glacier is part of setting the model for what can be done.
This might be more of a silly question, but with the bull trout and west slope that's a mouthful, west slope cutthroat trout, is wanting to keep them around to preserve the species? Are they like a common food source for humans, or is it a mixture of both?
To preserve the species. They can be fished, catch and release. But it's really for them still being here, for native trout. People have mixed trout in with other trout all over the place with pretty disastrous results. So we're trying to set things back. And in some cases, looking at the species that we can see are impacted by warmer waters, or they're impacted by inbreeding with non-native fish. And we're trying to create a place for them to persist. Otherwise, it's fairly certain
the case
that they'll succumb to those pressures and they'll no longer be.
I know another project within Glacier is the white bark pine restoration. What type of effort is that? Is that restoring it to a place it previously was?
Yeah, I would still call it a little bit of a directive project. The white bark pine are affected by blister rust, which is also a function of changing climate and warmer temperatures. So disease, bugs, and fire, which is obviously a climate-related metric. And there's species that are highly dependent upon them, and vice versa. Grizzly bear will get into the white bark too. The seeds are a good source for them, food. So to have those around for decades now, we've been looking at we'll call them the plus trees, the ones that have been resistant to disease, the ones that are thriving, and collect seeds from those and start them in nurseries and plant them into recently burned areas and other microclimates. They can thrive. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm seeing, as you talk about it more, just this idea of instead of being reactive to different, and sometimes you just have to be reactive to, certain situations, but this is both these initiatives sound like it's seeing the direction things are going from a climate change perspective and trying to help prolong certain things. So that's really cool.
Yeah, we're definitely hands-on and assisting with the white bark, and it's the kind of change that we may not see in our individual lifetimes. It takes a very long time for these trees to mature, to be of a size that really makes you kind of go, wow, that's an impressive tree. But they're growing now, and there are folks that will go out, and I've seen their photographs standing next to them, and there's a lot of pride in that work.
Yeah,
And
that's awesome.
yeah, it's making those environments more resilient to a changing climate so that we don't lose white bark pine. And with them, we would lose perhaps Clark's nutcracker and a food source for other birds and animals.
Yeah. A question I have been excited to ask, and this is like bringing out some of the nerdiness in just some of the previous jobs I've had, but like speaking to the data science realm of things, it's evident that you bring a data heavy approach to managing the park. I would love to hear a little bit more about that. And also, if you had any things that come to mind with regards to surprising facts you've learned from said data crunching.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever looked at a spreadsheet and kind of go, wow.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I thank you. I take it as a compliment, being a bit of a data
absolutely.
nerd on it. That's part of our mission. We should be making decisions based on science and careful analysis. We use data in lots of ways. The example that comes to mind for me the most is not really like natural resource data, although that's my background. I came up in GIS and dealing with spatial information, but it's the data around visitor use in the parks. And as we've been piloting different methods of managed entry into the park in order to prevent congestion and degradation of the park experience, if it's too crowded, it's no longer an enjoyable park. And there's resource damage that comes from that. So we have monitored everything: traffic counters, camera traps on vehicles, looking at the times the parking lots fill. There's so many different ways that we're hooking up wires to what's happening in the park every day. And we are using that real-time information. We can make adjustments in the number of reservations that are available based on what we see the day or the week before. And so the system is fairly refined now, and it's so amazing to work at a park where you can sit down with the rest of the leadership and be having fresh information of what visitors are doing in your park, where they're going, and say, okay, what can we do to improve upon that for next week? So yeah, being able to use it in real time has been tremendous. And we don't have the data back from this study that we did last year, but this one just blows my mind. We were signing up as sort of data volunteers, guinea pigs, people to carry a GPS unit in the park during their visit. They would pick them up from a roadside pull out and just drop it in the box or drop it off at the visitor center when they're done. And these visitors were allowing themselves to record essentially where they went in the park. So we're going to have this random sample of people hiking trails, and did they hike all of it? Did they turn back a certain way? Which trail did they use? It's very hard to obtain that information in any other way. And I can't wait to see the results from that.
As you're talking about kind of the real-time data again, the data nerd in me is thinking just for folks who like aren't in that world, to have real-time data is actually pretty difficult. And I've worked with a lot of clients that I consulted in the retail space, and connecting the data, sometimes even having like point of sale data for the previous week they didn't have. And these are like big retail brands. And so it's awesome to hear that you guys are able to have that real-time data pipeline.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because these aren't the tools that you would expect the National Park Service to really have much expertise with. And we don't. We're just learning, right? And we don't have a point of sale system like Amazon does, so that when something comes off the shelf, it knows to be restocked. But within our means, within projects that are frequently funded through our partners, we're able to dip our toes in the water, learn a little bit about visitor behavior, and use that information to help create better experiences in the park.
Yeah, that's really cool. I have a final question that I wrap things up with, but before that, you kind of, again, made a perfect segue. I was like, there's still one thing I want to ask about. You mentioned some of your nonprofit partners. I'd love to share or hear briefly just some of I know there's the Glacier National Park Conservancy, Glacier National Park Voluntary Associates. I'd love to hear your perspective of how they work with you and with Glacier in supporting Glacier's goals.
Yeah, Maddie, we couldn't do what we do at Glacier without partners. And starting with Glacier National Park Conservancy, they're vital partners for us. They have members, they have donors, and they fund more than 40 projects in the park, more than $3 million of support annually to park projects. They're things that we would not otherwise be able to do without that support. So being able to work with them and match the interests of donors to the mission of the Park Service and of Glacier, I think it's a great partner to have, and really makes a difference in projects we undertake and just in the number of green and gray people you see when you come to Glacier. So that's all possible because of that support. Other partners that we have are the Glacier National Park Volunteer Associates. They are wonderful. They contribute thousands of hours of very talented people, some of them doing among the hardest jobs in the park, including having a lot of those conversations around high visitation and talking to visitors about how to visit Glacier. And they can be pretty tough, but they're tough people. I love working with them. And a third partner I'll mention is Glacier Institute. They're our educational partners. And they operate a camp inside Glacier. They also work with the Flathead National Forest. And I really like a lot of the things that they do. STEAM camps for girls and trying to get people interested into the park at an early age in a very field-based way. That creates future park superintendents, probably.
Yeah, honestly, that's been one of my favorite things is learning. And I'm really glad you added the education component, because that's been one of my favorite things. Learning about all the different programs at the parks typically aimed at integrating folks from surrounding communities into those educational opportunities. And then maybe in some cases also folks who don't necessarily live there can do that. So that's really cool. I know we are at the end of our time. And so a way I like to wrap up our conversations is asking, what is something you wish everyone knew about Glacier National Park, regardless of if they have or haven't been?
What I wish everyone would know about Glacier and come to appreciate more is that before park establishment in 1910, this was a park that was lived in and used by people before us, by the Blackfeet, by the Salish and Kootenai peoples, and they're still here. They still have meaningful connections to the park, very important connections, ones that I think the Park Service is growing in our understanding and capacity to honor and support.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. It is, I think, good to have those reminders as we're talking about all these different national parks. But yeah, thank you, Dave, for your time. I've really loved hearing some of your perspective on Glacier and your experience. So thanks for sharing your story.
Thanks, Maddie. Yeah, next time you're hiking, take a huckleberry and a thimbleberry, put them together. That's the way.
Yes. And it creates, and we need a special name for that, but for now we'll call it a berry sandwich. Thanks so much for listening today. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. If you liked this podcast, rate, review, download, and tell your friends about it. This ensures the stories of our national parks and how they are run are shared. Listen to the other episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts, or visit us at whorunsThisPark.com to learn more. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.